Steve, did you want to make a few comments before we take Q&A?
Sure. I would like to echo a lot of what they said. I mean, there's so much unknown here, right? We don't know what fertility is necessarily going to be, and no one seems to be able to predict the level of immigration because these are all human decisions, and we haven't been able to get that right. It's, I guess, one area where I would slightly disagree with Lindsay, or maybe more, is he said at the end that the impact of immigration isn't that big. I mean, I guess that's ultimately for the reader to decide. I think you would guess from my comments, I think adding 75 million people to the U.S. population, or making it 75 million larger than it otherwise would be in 4 decades, seems like a big number to me. It's equal to the entire population of France, as I said. If you compare the last census in 2010, you could throw in France and Belgium and maybe the Netherlands. That's a lot of people to add, and it does seem, based on the latest surveys, just to give you one example, that Americans very much prefer to live in low-density areas, suburbs, rural areas. The march to the suburbs continues, kind of unabated. What does it mean to add another million people to the Washington metro area? What does it mean for the preservation of open space? What does it mean for traffic and congestion? What does it mean to grow California to 50 million or Texas to 40 million? That's what immigration does, and plays a huge role in California and a very significant role in Texas and an enormous role, say, here in the D.C. area. So those things are big. And remember, all the population growth that immigration and we experience it occur in about 100 counties in the United States. So it's, people say, well, Wyoming's empty. We could fill it up. That's true. But the reality is immigrants don't go to Wyoming. Native-born people don't move to Wyoming. Almost all this population growth we're discussing is occurring within about 100 counties or 50 metro areas in the United States. And that's worth thinking about. That seems like a big effect. Now, you could still argue for population. You could say, look, more people means more opportunities for businesses and more opportunities for consumers. I'm a skeptic of that position, but you can argue it. But I guess I don't think that 75 million, and by the way, it doesn't end at 75 million. If you just take these projections out a little longer, you can easily, in another 10 years, you can get to 95 million pretty quick by, say, 2070, if you just assume the level of immigration that the Census Bureau projects. So they seem like big numbers, but again, that is ultimately the judgment of the reader.
Since I paid for the microphone, I'll ask the first question, but think about what your questions are, and there's a mic in the back. What I wanted to ask is sort of a general question that the answer is obviously yes, but I'd like some people's thoughts on it. Different levels of immigration would actually affect some of these other phenomena. In other words, is it at least conceivable that lower level of immigration might actually raise native-born fertility, for instance? Or that a lower level of immigration might actually, at least in part, because there's a lot of moving parts here, help draw more less educated men into the labor market. And so I just wanted to hear people's thoughts on that.
Well, obviously, on the second question, would a lower level of immigration be helpful in getting less educated men in particular back in the labor force? Obviously, people have been debating this forever. What we do know is the decline in the labor force participation of less educated men does coincide with the massive growth in immigration. But whether it caused it is a more open question. I would say it seems very difficult to imagine that we're going to get the millions of less educated people who are currently not working back into the labor force if we keep immigration this high, because I do think that, in a way, someone who's been American who's been out of the labor force for a while has problems, significant social disadvantages, and if you listen to employers, the immigrant is definitely the preferred person. And you can see why that might be good, right? You get a good worker. I mean, the classic place where people have looked at this is teenage employment. It does appear that the decline in teenage employment is very much associated with immigration. And why that matters, and why that likely matters in the long run too, is that the research shows that if you don't work when you're a teenager and you don't go on to college, which is about half of our kids, then you're much less likely to work later in life. And so one of the ways immigration might be displacing natives is more early in their life. Later in life, their presence may make less difference, but it's early in life, and then that plays out. On the question of the impact on fertility, people have looked at that. We can't seem to find much evidence of it. But the notion is, just to flesh it out, is immigration makes affordable family formation more difficult. The idea is that if you raise the cost of housing, if you increase job competition, it makes it less likely that Americans will choose to have children. It's plausible, but it'd be it's hard to test. And to the best of my knowledge, the little bit of work that's been done on it doesn't seem to show that immigration is reducing native fertility, though it might.
Guys?
I think you may have a more complete answer than I would only point out that one thing that's interesting is the fertility rates are dropping across both groups, foreign-born and native-born. So
Right.
there seems to be something else going on. A lot of these things are kind of like master trends that we don't always understand until years after. On the labor force participation rate, I think the straightforward answer seems to be that there is an agreement among most economists that low-skilled migrants adversely affect the labor market performance of low-skilled natives. That's 10 to 15% of the population at most, so it's a small population, but we are concerned. How well you deal with that goes a long ways. And of course, the other wild card, because we like wild cards here, is the reason we're talking about universal income kind of programs is because people are worried about robots and what that's going to do. But that's science fiction out in the future.
Yeah, no, I would. I think I'd echo Lindsay on this. I don't think we have a very good answer, at least at the moment, for why America's period fertility rate dropped so sharply since the crash. There's a good argument that this is a continuing impact of an economic nature, since a really scary number of Americans tell us that we're still in a recession. If you ask people, are we in a recession? There also seems to be a sort of a millennial moment where people's outlook and values and view about family and family formation are also changing. I can't parse this for you. I can tell you that the best predictor anywhere of fertility levels is always desired fertility, wanted fertility on the part of women. If we knew how that was changing and how immigration was affecting that, we'd have a much better sense of all this, I guess. With regard to labor force participation for our least skilled native-born men, of course it has to be true that a greater supply means a lower price. I mean, that's kind of like economics 1. And so if there is a greater supply of low-skilled migration from abroad, all other things being equal, that's going to lower wages. I mean, that's George Borjas, that's a lot of people who've looked at this. However, if you start digging down at this, I think there's an awful lot of heterogeneity in the less skilled U.S. male working age population. And when you look at the native-born, unmarried, lower education demographic that I was describing, there are some things we don't usually collect information on, which I think are important to keep in mind. One of these is the enormously high proportion of this group that has a felony conviction in their background. I think it is a scandal that the Bureau of Justice Statistics and the Census Bureau doesn't regularly collect and analyze this sort of information. But my own back-of-the-envelope calculations are that 1 in 8 adult American men has a felony conviction in his background, not behind bars, in the general population. And it's probably an awful lot higher for lower skilled men. That's a big impediment to participation in the labor force. Likewise, the disability and opioid archipelago is a new phenomenon that, among other things, is a terrible disadvantage for people who are caught up in this. And just how much the increase in wages and the effect of a higher higher wage versus your reservation wage will influence labor force participation for people who have this set of really terrible disadvantages as part of their biography is something I don't think we've paid enough attention to.
I want to one follow-up. There is the question of the absolute labor market competition between immigrants and natives. There is a second argument that people raise the concern is that with large-scale unskilled immigration, it lets us ignore the problem much greater.
Yes.
So that politically, employers would say, well, look, we got to try to do more to rehabilitate prisoners and to get people off drugs. Oh, wait. Got immigrants to do this work. Why do I care? That's one of the concerns. That is the other thing. It changes the incentive structure of our society and our political system. We can just ignore them, and with a cascading series of social consequences. So there's the job competition question, and then there's the sort of larger political social question.
Okay, thanks. Now I think that we have introduced a phrase into the English language, the opioid disability archipelago, which I think was a great phrase. If we can take questions. Anybody has questions? We've got to wait for the microphone. Yes.
Hi, I'm Laura Francis. I'm a reporter with Bloomberg Law. I wanted to pick up on something that you had said, Lindsay, about the skill level of immigrants. And I'm assuming that, you know, these projections from the Census Bureau are all based on the current immigration system, which is heavily skewed toward family-based immigration. And, you know, with the president's call for more of a merit-based immigration system, if policymakers were to change the system so that, you know, it kind of flip-flops and it's more heavily in favor of people with certain skill levels, or maybe, you know, employment-based immigration as opposed to family-based, how would that affect, you know, what you're seeing in terms of the effects of immigration on the United States?
So it's a bit of a mind experiment, right? I mean, one estimate I saw for the United States and a couple of other countries is it would need 1.5 million college-educated migrants annually to offset all the adverse effects of aging, because skilled migration has that kind of impact. It's not going to happen. But you can't imagine that moving towards a markedly better skill distribution would improve these kinds of outcomes for a host of reasons. I don't think it's in the cards of the United States. I don't even know how to address that, simply because we back into so many problems with the U.S. in terms of our temporary migration system, which is where we get our largest supply of skilled migrants currently. And that has a huge number of problems that to some extent minimizes the potential positive impact that they would otherwise have. And at the same time, we're seeing there are ways shy of point systems and really aggressively changing classes of admission, which is what the Jordan Commission argued for 20 years ago, of nudging things toward a more skilled composition. And that could include family migrants too, if you start playing around with the edges in terms of how you bring people in and who you bring in. And I think those would be favorable ways to go that aren't as, you know, as aggressive as saying, let's do what Canada does, which is bring in 2 to 3 times the number of skilled migrants than they do on the family basis, and really screening for very highly skilled individuals. I think there are intermediate steps we could do that would be favorable.
Yeah, I mean, there are 2 points. The first point is there's just no question that more educated immigrants do much better. They pay more in taxes. They use less in public services. So that's all to the good, right? It could help in some ways. And if you had the right immigrants, it could. Having said that, it's very complicated. The most recent Census Bureau data shows that immigrants have become more educated. The share who have less than a high school is way down. The share with more of the college is up. And it doesn't seem to make any difference. The share of new arrivals who live in poverty or on Medicaid or other measures or in the labor force doesn't look any better over the last 10 years. It's kind of puzzling. One of the reasons seems to be related, to just show you how complicated it is, when you give immigrants literacy tests, and this is a big if, they've been educated outside of the United States, they score, those with a college degree, scored at about the same level of someone with a high school education in the United States. And they actually do also worse on math than college-educated natives, which is more puzzling to me. However, those educated into the United States almost do as well as natives educated in the United States. But about half, very, very roughly, of college-educated immigrants have a foreign degree, and it doesn't seem to matter. So you'd have to take that into account. You know, if you wanted to select skilled immigrants, you don't want to go to India necessarily, or China, or any place that seems to want to send a lot of skilled people, and just take people at their word they have a college degree if you want the most skilled. It's complicated. Then they may not be as skilled as they seem on paper. And you'd have to think about those who were educated in the United States and that sort of thing. And so very complicated. But as a general proposition, more skills it should translate into better outcomes in the United States.
Next question? Yeah, in the back.
Hi, my name is Ian Snively. I'm with Town Hall. I just wanted to ask about the number of people, native-born, who don't end up with a high school diploma or just have a high school diploma. Could you just go over quickly the significance of that number group?
Well, of course, it's still enormous, right? About 38% of adults, say 18 to 65 in the United States, have zero education beyond high school. And of those with a college degree, what it's like 34% of 18 to 65 or 21 to 65-year-olds have a college degree, something like that, 34%. So the rest have some college. And some colleges are really mixed group. Some of them seem to have a lot of, they might be like, 2 years nursing degree, they have a good job. And some of them are just a kid who took a couple of classes, and he's no different than a high school graduate, if that. So, yes, it's true that one of the things the United States, I'd say, is a general proposition that 38% of the 150 million people in the U.S. workforce has struggled. Their real wages don't look good, even long-term. Their employment rates don't look good. The share who get benefits from their employers don't look good. That is like health insurance and stuff. So they've really struggled. I think everyone agrees. And one of the concerns about high levels of immigration is, does it adversely affect, say, people with only a high school degree or less? Most people have looked at only the high school only, but the less than high school, but there's also, less than high school is about 8% of that 38%. So most of them have a high school degree, but nothing else. And that's a lot of Americans, and they've really struggled. And it's hard to find evidence just looking at the normal measures that we have a labor shortage in those categories, even though employers are constantly saying we need nannies, maids, busboys, construction labor constantly. Real wages in all those categories haven't grown. Real wages for workers with that level of education hasn't grown, and their labor force participation for the high school only doesn't look as bad as it does for the dropouts by any means, but it doesn't look particularly good either, even with the recent improvements.
Anyone else? Any other questions? Go ahead.
I just want to echo what Nick was saying here. When I saw Frank Bean's portrayal or portrait of those that were talking about the low end of the labor market in the past, it was shocking because the use of drugs, the use of the broken families, the disenfranchisement of that young population, that lesser educated population is pretty dramatic in the United States. Would less immigration help? I don't know. We're not going to sit up here and have that debate. But it does call the question again, using this argument that we need more or less migrants on just this particular issue, I think you can see the type of migration, moving towards skilled migration, having a more positive effect on these lower educated population in the United States, because that's what the data tells us we should expect. But again, we're talking about more fundamental problems in many ways that getting too caught up with the migration argument, I think, kind of detracts, with a big caveat again as to what part of the migration argument you're having. And that is not just about numbers, it's about the type of migrants, it's about the legality of migrants, it's about the nature of the labor market and how we manage it.
Okay, well, if there's no other questions, I appreciate everybody coming. Thank you very much to Nick and Lindsay for their thoughtful comments. This will be on our website. It'll be posted in relatively short order, and hope to see you all at our next event. Thank you.